There is a photograph that circulated in a 1952 issue of McCall's magazine that has always struck cosmetic historians as quietly extraordinary. In it, a woman sits at a zinc-topped vanity table sometime around 10 o'clock in the evening, her face entirely obscured by a thick, luminous mask of cold cream. She's not distressed. She's not mid-ritual in any anxious sense. She's utterly serene, one hand lifting a soft linen cloth, the other resting in her lap with the composure of someone who has done this exact thing 10,000 times before. There is a kind of ceremony to her posture, a priestess-like quality in the way she regards her own reflection, and the caption beneath the image reads simply, "Her nightly devotion." 2 words, and yet they capture everything about what cold cream meant to the women of post-war America. Not vanity, not indulgence, but devotion. A daily covenant between a woman and the version of herself she was determined to preserve. It is impossible to understand the 1950s woman and her beauty culture without understanding cold cream first, because cold cream was not merely a product, it was a philosophy. It was the bedrock upon which all other rituals were stacked: the rouge, the powder, the setting lotion, the pressed foundation, and it was the substance that erased all of it again at the end of the day with a kind of gentle ferocity. Cold cream was the beginning and the end, the alpha and the omega of every American woman's vanity table, and the industry that had grown up around it by the time the 1950s arrived was enormous, culturally dominant, and surprisingly competitive. To understand that competition, you have to go back further than most people expect. Cold cream itself is not a mid-century invention. It was formulated in approximately the 2nd century by the Greek physician Galen, who combined beeswax, olive oil, water, and rose petals into a semi-solid emollient intended to soften and cool inflamed skin. The name cold cream came directly from this cooling sensation. The water in the emulsion evaporates on contact with skin, producing a distinctly pleasant chill that struck ancient users as almost medicinal. For nearly 17 centuries, cold cream changed very little. It was a product that existed in apothecaries and in handwritten household recipe books, something women made at home or purchased in small ceramic pots, from chemists who had a reputation for reliability. Then the industrial age arrived. Glass jars became mass-producible, national railway systems made distribution possible coast to coast, and suddenly cold cream was no longer a local curiosity. It was a commodity with a mass market waiting to be seized. Pond's Extract Company, which had begun its commercial life in the 1850s selling a patent witch hazel tonic, understood this shift before almost anyone else. By the turn of the 20th century, Pond's had pivoted decisively toward cold cream and vanishing cream as its flagship products, and by the 1920s, the company had launched one of the most culturally ambitious advertising campaigns in American history, the Pond's Testimonial Campaign. The strategy was audacious. Instead of paying professional actresses or hired models to endorse the product, Pond's approached actual women from the American social elite, countesses, daughters of industrialists, prominent socialites whose names appeared regularly in the society pages of major newspapers, and paid them to testify in print that they used Pond's cold cream as their nightly ritual. The advertisements were almost novelistic in their construction. They featured formal portrait photographs, brief biographical sketches that established social credentials, and paragraphs of apparently personal testimony in which these women described, with great specificity, their devotion to the cream. The effect was exactly what Pond's intended. If the cream was good enough for a woman who travelled between Newport and Paris and was photographed at the best parties in both cities, it was surely good enough for a schoolteacher in Dayton, Ohio. By the time the 1950s opened, Pond's had spent 3 decades building an association between cold cream and aspirational femininity that was essentially unassailable. But Pond's was not alone in this game, and the 1950s would prove to be the most ferociously competitive decade in cold cream's long commercial history. Woodbury Facial Cream, produced by the Andrew Jergens Company, had its own loyalists and its own advertising mythology. Noxzema, which had begun in Baltimore in 1914 as a product recommended by a physician for sunburned skin, had built a devoted following among women who preferred a product that smelled medicinal and felt purposeful rather than luxurious. Albolene, originally formulated as a theatrical makeup remover for stage performers, had crossed over into domestic use because its heavy mineral oil base was extraordinarily efficient at dissolving grease paint, which made it equally efficient at dissolving the increasingly theatrical makeup that mid-century women were wearing day to day, as cosmetics moved from subtle to bold throughout the decade. The average vanity table in 1954 might hold any one of a dozen cold cream variations, each with its own claimed specialty and its own devoted advocate in the woman who used it. What all of them shared, however, was the ritual itself, and that ritual was far more elaborate than most modern observers assume. The application of cold cream was not a 30-second swipe before bed. It was a multi-step process governed by specific techniques that passed between women the way recipes passed between home cooks, from mother to daughter, from neighbour to neighbour, from magazine page to dressing table. The cream was warmed first, rubbed briefly between the palms, or allowed to soften from the ambient warmth of the fingers, because a cold cream applied at room temperature was believed to close the pores before the product could fully penetrate. It was then massaged into the face using upward strokes, always upward, because downward strokes were thought to encourage sagging, working from the jaw toward the forehead, and finishing with gentle circular motions around the eyes where the skin was thinnest and most vulnerable. The cream was then left on for a prescribed period. Some routines called for 5 minutes, others for as long as 20, with a second application sometimes following the first removal, and wiped away not with paper tissue but with the softest available cloth, ideally muslin or fine flannel, because rougher fabrics were believed to cause premature lines. This elaborate choreography was not invented by the beauty industry. Or rather, it was not invented only by the beauty industry. It was co-constructed between advertisers and consumers, between magazine beauty editors and the women who read them, between the dermatologists who began appearing in beauty columns throughout the decade, lending scientific credibility to what had previously been folk knowledge. The 1950s was the first decade in which the concept of the scientifically validated skincare routine achieved genuine cultural saturation. Advertisements that had once focused on glamour and aspiration increasingly added ingredient lists, dermatologist endorsements, and laboratory language. Ponds began running advertisements that described their cold cream's emollient properties in clinical terms alongside the testimonial photographs. Noxzema leaned heavily on its original medical associations, positioning itself as the cream that a doctor might actually recommend. Even smaller brands that could not afford major advertising campaigns made their pitches in the language of science, listing stearic acid concentrations and mineral oil grades as if these details would be intelligible and meaningful to the average consumer, and increasingly they were, because the beauty magazines had spent a decade educating their readers in exactly this vocabulary. The urban environment of the 1950s contributed its own urgency to cold cream devotion. The post-war American city was heavily industrialized, and the air quality of major metropolitan areas was genuinely poor by any modern measure. Coal heating was still common in the early part of the decade. Automobile exhaust had not yet been regulated. Factory output in manufacturing centers like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland produced visible particulate matter that settled on every surface, including skin. Women who spent their days in these environments were not merely maintaining a cosmetic ritual when they removed their makeup each night. They were engaged in genuine environmental decontamination, clearing their pores of actual industrial pollutants that had accumulated over the course of a day spent in a city. The cold cream companies were not oblivious to this selling point. Advertisements from the early 50s frequently used language that emphasized protection from the elements, defense against the grime and smoke of modern urban life, the nightly restoration of skin that had been assaulted by the world outside. Cold cream was positioned not only as beauty maintenance, but as an act of self-preservation. What is perhaps most striking about cold cream culture from this distance, however, is its intimacy. The vanity table ritual was among the most private moments in a mid-century woman's day, a brief period of solitary self-possession in lives that were otherwise structured almost entirely around the needs and rhythms of others. Husbands, children, employers, neighbours, social obligations of every variety. The face that greeted the cold cream jar each night was not the public face, the powdered, rouged, lipsticked, perfectly composed face that had moved through the world all day. It was the unguarded face, the face that no one else in most cases was permitted to see. And the ritual of cold cream was the ritual of tending that private face with patience and attention, and a kind of deliberate care that the public face rarely received. There is something in that private devotion, in the woman alone at her vanity at 10 o'clock, the household quiet around her her palms warm and white with cream, that speaks not of vanity at all, but of something much closer to self-respect. The 1950s did not always give women a great deal of room to practice self-respect. The cold cream jar was one of the places where they found it. Beyond the individual woman at her vanity, cold cream culture also operated as a form of intergenerational transmission. One of the most consistent threads of feminine knowledge passed between mothers and daughters throughout the decade. The instruction in cold cream technique was rarely formal or explicit. It happened in bathrooms, at shared vanity tables, in the quiet watching of a mother's nightly ritual by a daughter who absorbed, without being told, the specific order of operations, the favoured brand, the precise pressure of application and removal. This transmission was neither trivial nor coincidental. It represented the handing on of a survival skill, or at least of what the culture of the period treated as a survival skill. The knowledge of how to maintain a presentable face in a world that evaluated women substantially on the condition of their faces. The 1950s also saw the first serious scientific research into what cold cream was actually doing to skin at the cellular level, and the results of that research began slowly filtering into popular beauty discourse in ways that complicated the industry's long-standing marketing claims. Dermatologists writing in popular magazines began to distinguish between the actual measurable hydration benefits of an occlusive emollient product like cold cream, which were real, though more modest than the advertising claimed, and the mythological benefits that the industry had attached to its products over decades of marketing. The cleansing claims, in particular, came under scrutiny. The cold cream dissolves makeup perfectly narrative, while broadly accurate in the sense that oils do dissolve oil-based cosmetics, obscured the fact that the residual cream left on the skin after tissue removal could itself clog pores if not removed with a second wash step, a nuance that the industry had little incentive to emphasize, and that the beauty magazines took some years to communicate effectively to their readers. What the research did not and could not undermine was the psychological dimension of the cold cream ritual, because that dimension was not contingent on the product's specific clinical efficacy. The benefit of a nightly ritual is not only in what the ritual accomplishes materially, but in the fact of the ritual itself. The daily return to a fixed practice, the sensation of attending to oneself, the specific olfactory and tactile pleasures of a product whose smell and feel have accumulated years of positive association. The cold cream that smelled like ponds, the cold cream that felt like Noxzema's characteristic cool sting, the particular weight of a cold cream jar in the hand, the specific resistance of the lid as it was unscrewed. These sensory details were not peripheral to the ritual's value, they were central to it, and the women who came of age with these products, who used them through the 1950s and continued using them for decades after, were sustained in part by exactly this quality. The daily return to a known sensation in a world that was constantly changing around them. Pond's cold cream and its competitors have undergone various reformulations and ownership changes in the decades since the 1950s, but the core product, the white emulsified blend of oils, waxes and water, remains essentially available in essentially its historical form. The modern woman who lifts a Pond's jar and removes its lid is making the same gesture, receiving the same slightly astringent floral scent, experiencing the same cool slip of emollient on warm skin as her grandmother did at a zinc-topped vanity in 1954. There is something genuinely remarkable in that continuity, in the fact that among all the products that the mid-century beauty industry created and marketed with such extravagant ambition and such sustained commercial energy, the simplest and oldest of them all is the one that has survived most completely and most faithfully into the present. The cold cream endures, which suggests perhaps that the devotion it inspired was not primarily a product of advertising after all. It was a recognition of something real. In the summer of 1955, a sociologist named Martha Wolfenstein published a slim academic essay in the journal Psychiatry titled The Emergence of Fun Morality, in which she argued somewhat dryly that American popular culture had begun to organize itself around two competing, feminine ideals that were in direct and irresolvable tension with each other. She called them, in somewhat clinical terms, the good girl and the pleasure seeker. But the rest of America had already given these two archetypes far more vivid names, and those names were Grace Kelly and Marilyn Monroe. The fact that both women were at the peak of their cultural visibility in exactly the same years, that their photographs appeared in the same magazines on the same newsstands, that their films ran in adjacent theatres at the same multiplex, that their names were spoken in the same sentences by women trying to decide what kind of woman they wanted to be, is one of the most revealing coincidences in the history of American femininity. It was not really a coincidence at all. It was a cultural argument conducted in lipstick and camera angles, and the 1950s was the decade in which that argument became loud enough for everyone to hear. Grace Kelly and Marilyn Monroe represent something more historically interesting than a simple binary between refinement and sensuality. They represent two entirely different theories of what makeup was for, what beauty was for, what the relationship between a woman and her own appearance was supposed to be about. To understand this, you have to understand what went into making their respective faces, because the faces that appeared on screen and in magazine photographs were not natural faces. They were engineered faces, produced through techniques of astonishing sophistication by studio makeup departments that operated with the precision and proprietary secrecy of pharmaceutical laboratories. The MGM makeup department, where Kelly spent much of her brief film career, was by 1952 the most technically advanced theatrical cosmetics facility in the world. It employed dozens of trained makeup artists who had developed their own proprietary products, techniques, and methodologies over 3 decades of film production. The transition from black and white film stock to colour Technicolor in the late 1940s had forced a complete reinvention of theatrical makeup chemistry, because the colours that read correctly on monochrome film appeared garish and wrong under colour photography, and vice versa. Foundation formulations that had been perfected over 20 years of studio work had to be entirely reconsidered. The deep, dramatic eye makeup that was standard in black and white production turned actresses into wide-eyed cartoon figures in full colour. Everything had to be rethought, and the MGM team rethought it with the intensity of people whose professional survival depended on the outcome. For Grace Kelly specifically, the studio's approach was to amplify the qualities she already possessed while creating an impression of effortlessness that required extraordinary effort to achieve. Her complexion was already fair and fine-textured, and her foundation was matched to her skin so precisely that observers frequently described her as wearing no foundation at all, which was not remotely accurate. The formulation used on Kelly, a custom-blended product that MGM's chief makeup artist William Tuttle had developed specifically for her colouring, was applied in extraordinarily thin layers and set with a translucent powder so finely milled that it was essentially invisible in natural light. Her eyebrows were shaped and filled to appear as natural as possible, while still being perfectly symmetrical and architecturally refined. Her lipstick, a recurring subject of beauty journalism throughout her career, was a mid-tone rose pink in early films, shifting toward a warmer coral as her screen image developed, always applied with a brush rather than directly from the tube to produce precise, clean edges that a direct application could not achieve. The overall effect was of a woman who had been born with her face entirely in order, requiring no intervention. The intervention was, of course, total. The 20th Century Fox makeup department, which managed Marilyn Monroe, was pursuing an entirely opposite philosophy with an equally systematic precision. Where MGM wanted Kelly to look unconstructed, Fox wanted Monroe to look exaggerated, but exaggerated in specifically and deliberately calibrated ways that operated somewhere between realism and fantasy. Monroe's foundation base was a full shade lighter than her natural skin tone, used to create a luminous pallor that the studio's lighting team could exploit to produce an almost incandescent quality on screen. Her lips were overdrawn at the corners and the centre of the upper lip, extending beyond her natural lip line to create a fullness that no amount of lip liner could have produced without this specific technique. The false beauty mark above her left lip was applied with a grease paint pencil and set with translucent powder, in a process that took approximately 4 minutes per application and had to be touched up every 2 hours under studio lighting. Her eye makeup, the combination of white highlighter on the inner corner of the eye, dark pencil liner on the upper and lower lids, curled and set lashes with multiple layers of mascara, and a precise application of pale shimmer on the centre of the lid, was a formula that her makeup artist Whitey Snyder had developed specifically to maximise the dramatic potential of her eyes under Fox's preferred lighting setup. What is important to understand about both of these faces is that they travelled. They did not remain on screen or in publicity photographs. They became templates, instruction sets, ideals that migrated from the movie theatre into the homes of ordinary American women through the intermediary of beauty magazines, television programmes, and the cosmetics industry's own advertising machinery. Revlon, which was in the early 1950s building the most aggressive marketing apparatus in American beauty history, understood this migration with extraordinary clarity. When Charles Revson launched his Fire and Ice campaign in 1952, a 2-page spread in Harper's Bazaar featuring model Dorian Lee in a scarlet sequined gown with a face that borrowed equally from the aristocratic refinement of Kelly and the brazen glamour of Monroe, he was not simply selling lipstick. He was offering American women the chance to inhabit both archetypes simultaneously, which was precisely what they wanted and what the era would not quite let them do in daily life. The question that the era never quite resolved, and that the existence of both archetypes made so urgent, was whether glamour was a form of power or a form of submission. For the women in studio makeup chairs, the answer was obvious. It was power. Both Kelly and Monroe spoke with great precision and authority about their own images. Kelly in particular was extensively documented in her conversations with studio makeup artists as someone who had firm opinions about her own face, who understood exactly which lighting conditions suited her and which did not, who knew what she wanted and communicated it clearly. Monroe's relationship with her appearance was more complicated but no less deliberate. She was deeply versed in the mechanics of her own beauty, having spent years studying her photographs and working backward to understand what produced the effects she wanted. Both women were not passive objects of the studio's attention, but active architects of their own visual presentation, and this agency, quiet, technical, precise, runs completely counter to the narrative that tends to surround beautiful women of the period. The public, however, did not have this context. What they had were the finished results, the magazine photographs and the movie screen images, and those images suggested that this kind of face was something that happened to a woman, not something a woman did. This gap between the reality of theatrical cosmetics, the hours, the expertise, the custom-blended products, the precision application, and the illusion of natural effortlessness that the best of those cosmetics produced is one of the central ironies of mid-century beauty culture. The most skilled and technically demanding makeup work was designed to look like no work at all, and the women who studied those finished images from the outside, who tried to replicate them with the drugstore products available to them, were essentially trying to reverse engineer an industrial process with tools that were several degrees of sophistication below what the original had required. This gap produced an enormous commercial opportunity, and the cosmetics industry rushed into it with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The 1950s saw the proliferation of step-by-step celebrity beauty guides in every major women's magazine, producing detailed, systematic breakdowns of how to achieve a particular star's look using commercially available products. Max Factor, which had begun as the official cosmetics supplier to the Hollywood studio system, had the most enviable position in this transition. They could credibly claim that the products they sold in drugstores were derived directly from the formulas they used on actual movie stars, and this claim was close enough to true to be effective as a marketing proposition. Their Pancake Foundation, originally developed in 1938 specifically for color film production, became one of the best-selling cosmetics products in America throughout the 1950s on precisely this basis. If it was good enough for the studio, the argument went, it was good enough for you. And American women, holding a compact of Pancake Foundation in a fluorescent-lit drugstore aisle and seeing Grace Kelly's face on the counter display behind it, were willing to believe that the distance between themselves and that studio makeup chair was perhaps not as vast as it seemed. The archetypes endured because they were not actually opposites. They were two expressions of the same desire, to present a face to the world that was fully controlled, fully intentional, fully and deliberately made. Whether that face suggested cool, aristocratic restraint or warm, unabashed allure was almost secondary to the shared project of construction that both represented. Every woman who sat down at her vanity table in the 1950s morning was in some sense sitting in a studio makeup chair, making decisions, with lipstick shades and powder puffs and the precise angle of her eyebrow pencil, about what story she was telling with her face that day and who she was choosing to be when she walked out the door into the world. The question of what happened when these two archetypal images collided with the bodies and budgets of ordinary American women is one of the most interesting stories in mid-century consumer culture. The answer, in short, is that the American cosmetics industry worked very hard to position itself as the bridge between the studio makeup chair and the bathroom vanity, and it did so with a sophistication and a sensitivity to consumer psychology that was, in its own way, as impressive as anything the makeup artists themselves were doing. Max Factor's Hollywood Color Harmony makeup system, which the company launched aggressively throughout the early and middle 1950s, was the era's most ambitious attempt to systematize the connection between professional, theatrical cosmetics and consumer beauty products. The system divided women into 4 color types: blonde, brunette, redhead, and brunette, a category Factor had invented to capture the large middle range of hair colors that did not fall cleanly into the other 3, and provided specific shade recommendations for foundation, rouge, lipstick, and eye makeup within each type. The logic was borrowed directly from the theatrical makeup practice of color-correcting skin tone and harmonizing the overall complexion under specific lighting conditions, but it had been simplified and democratized for a consumer audience that did not have access to theatrical lighting or professional application. The system was imperfect by any rigorous standard. The 4 color types were too broad to capture the genuine variation in human complexion, but it gave women a framework for making cosmetics choices that felt systematic and validated by professional practice, which is precisely what they needed. The advertising campaign that promoted this system ran in every major women's magazine from 1952 through 1958 and featured a specific rhetorical device that was enormously effective: the transformation narrative. Before and after photographs showing ordinary women who looked like neighbours, like co-workers, like versions of the reader, transformed by the correct application of the Hollywood Color Harmony products into something that approached, without quite matching, the professional studio results that appeared on the same magazine pages 30 pages earlier. The gap between the transformation's results and the professional ideal was not accidental. It was maintained carefully. A perfect replication of the studio face would have made the product appear alienating and unattainable. An obvious improvement on an ordinary starting point, an approach toward but not a rival at the ideal, kept the consumer moving along the product continuum, purchasing the next shade, the next formula, the next system in the ongoing pursuit of the transformation that was always just a little further along. This structure, the aspirational gap maintained at a specific distance, is the fundamental architecture of cosmetics marketing, and the 1950s was the decade in which it was perfected. What the 2 archetypes together had accomplished by the end of the decade was to establish beauty not as a natural attribute, but as an achievable practice, a set of skills that could be learned, a set of products that could be purchased, and a set of effects that could be reliably reproduced by any woman willing to invest the necessary time, attention, and money. This democratization of glamour, imperfect and commercially motivated as it was, represented a genuine cultural shift from earlier centuries when the beauty ideal had been inseparable from the social conditions, the leisure time, the domestic staff, the financial resources of the class that embodied it. The 1950s woman sitting at her drugstore makeup counter, selecting a Max Factor foundation in the shade her color type chart indicated, was participating in a project of self-reinvention that was historically new, commercially driven, and personally meaningful in ways that no simple narrative of manipulation or liberation can fully capture. A Revlon training manual from 1957, a slim, spiral-bound document distributed to department store beauty advisors across the eastern United States, opens its section on eye makeup with a sentence that has a striking, almost architectural quality to it. The eye is not the window of the soul, it is the frame of the face, and the frame must be drawn before the painting has any meaning. This was not poetry, it was sales instruction, but it reflects with remarkable precision the shift in cosmetic philosophy that had overtaken American beauty culture by the middle of the decade, a shift in which the eye had moved from a supporting element of the face to its organizing principle, the feature around which all other features arrange themselves in service, and the feature that, more than any other, communicated the social and sexual identity of the woman wearing it. The cat eye, the winged liner, the elongated doe. These terms describe the same basic technique from different angles, and their convergence in the vocabulary of 1950s American beauty culture is one of the period's most extraordinary aesthetic stories. The technique itself is ancient. Egyptian cosmetic artifacts dating to approximately 3000 BCE include applicator tools for kohl that were clearly designed to produce extended, winged effects at the outer corner of the eye, and the theatrical use of dramatic eyeliner stretches continuously through Greek, Roman, and theatrical traditions into the early 20th century. But the specific version of winged liner that became the defining eye look of the post-war American woman was not a direct continuation of any of these traditions. It was something more precisely technical, more geometrically considered, and more intimately tied to the specific optical challenges of mid-century cosmetics and mid-century cinema than any of its predecessors. To understand where the 1950s cat eye came from, you have to understand the state of eye makeup products in the years immediately preceding it. Throughout the 1930s and early 40s, the dominant eye makeup medium was a combination of pencil liner and pressed cake mascara, the latter applied with a small brush moistened with water and stroked across the compressed pigment cake before being transferred to the lashes. Both products had significant limitations. Pencil liner, regardless of how carefully it was sharpened, produced a line with visible texture, slightly fuzzy at the edges, prone to smudging, difficult to control at the precision required for a clean, sharp wing. Pressed cake mascara built up slowly and unevenly, dried stiff, and flaked in ways that were cosmetically catastrophic if they occurred at the wrong moment. Neither product was adequate for the demands that Technicolor film and later, high-resolution photography were placing on cosmetic performance. The solution arrived in stages. In 1949, Helena Rubinstein launched what is generally credited as the first mass-market liquid eyeliner, formulated specifically for consumer use, a product called Waterproof Mascara Matic, that was in fact not primarily a mascara at all but a brush-applied liquid liner that used a concentrated dye suspension in a quick-drying emollient base to produce a line of unprecedented precision and consistency. The wand applicator, thin, flexible, capable of tapering to a point fine enough to draw a line 1 millimeter wide, was the product's genuinely revolutionary element. For the first time, a woman outside a professional studio could apply a liner line that was genuinely sharp-edged, genuinely consistent in width, and genuinely resistant to the smudging and migration that had plagued pencil applications for decades. Revlon, Max Factor, and Maybelline all produced competing formulations within 2 years, and by 1952 the liquid liner category had become one of the fastest-growing segments of the American cosmetics market. The wing itself, the critical upward extension at the outer corner of the eye that gave the 1950s eye look its name and its cultural identity, developed as a specifically American adaptation of a technique that had been in use in European theatrical makeup for considerably longer. The core principle is simple. By extending the liner line beyond the natural edge of the eye and angling it slightly upward toward the temple, the makeup artist creates an optical illusion in which the eye appears larger, more elongated, and more dramatically almond-shaped than its natural form. But the execution is anything but simple, and the specific geometry of the American cat eye involved a series of precise technical decisions that varied enormously between practitioners and between women. The angle of the wing relative to the natural eye shape, the length of the extension, the thickness of the liner line at the base of the lashes versus at the tip of the wing, the relationship between the upper and lower liner lines. Each of these variables produced a distinctly different effect and required genuinely technical skill to manage. The beauty magazines of the period understood this technical complexity and addressed it with a seriousness that modern beauty media rarely achieves. A typical guide to cat eye application in a 1954 issue of Harper's Bazaar runs to over 800 words and includes multiple diagrams showing eye shapes classified into 5 categories: almond, round, wide set, close set, and deep set, each with its own specific liner geometry, recommended to achieve what the article calls the harmonious illusion. The language of optical correction runs through almost all mid-decade eye makeup guidance, reflecting a philosophy in which cosmetics were not simply applied to the face, but were used to reshape it according to specific proportional ideals derived partly from classical aesthetics and partly from the face shape mathematics that Hollywood makeup artists had been developing since the 1920s. Max Factor's famous golden ratio of facial proportions, a system his studio had used to analyze and alter the faces of every major Hollywood star, had filtered into popular cosmetics culture by mid-decade, and the cat eye was its primary tool for eye region correction. What the beauty manuals did not say, but what becomes clear from reading women's diaries, letters, and personal accounts from the period, is that the cat eye also carried an enormous freight of social meaning that had very little to do with optical proportion. The wing liner was, for many women, a way of inserting a slight element of theatrical defiance into an otherwise strictly governed personal presentation. The 1950s woman was subject to a degree of scrutiny and regulation regarding her appearance that is difficult to convey to a modern reader who has not encountered primary sources from the period. Professional dress codes in offices and department stores frequently specified not only skirt length and the requirement for hosiery, but the appropriate level of cosmetic application, with supervisors empowered to send home employees whose makeup was considered insufficient or excessive by whatever standard the particular workplace applied. In this environment, the precisely controlled drama of a sharply drawn, elegantly winged eyeliner was one of the few permissible forms of cosmetic expressiveness, too precise and technical to be dismissed as sloppy or excessive, too unmistakably deliberate to be mistaken for no effort at all. The products that women were using to achieve this effect also became objects of considerable commercial devotion. Maybelline's Ultra Lash, the brand's entry into the liquid liner market, launched in 1953 in a small, flat-bottomed glass bottle with a flexible wand applicator, developed a following so passionate that women wrote letters to the company describing the specific way they stored the bottle to prevent the formula from thickening, the exact brush pressure they used to produce a line of consistent width, and their distress when regional variations in distribution meant their preferred product was temporarily unavailable in their area. These letters are preserved in the Maybelline Company archives, and they read like correspondence about a beloved technology, detailed, technical, earnest, and revealing of the degree to which women had become genuine experts in the application of their preferred products through extensive practice and systematic refinement. The doe eye, the softer variation of the cat eye that dominated the look's second wave in the late 1950s, required a different product profile. Where the sharp cat eye was the domain of liquid liner and demanded precision above all, the doe eye used a combination of heavier pencil applications smudged at the edges, multiple layers of volumizing mascara, and the strategic application of white or very pale nude liner on the inner waterline to create an illusion of wide-open innocent luminosity. This was the look associated with actresses like Audrey Hepburn and Debbie Reynolds. Large, guileless, slightly startled, and its technical demands were different from but not less than the demands of the architectural wing. The smudging technique required control. Too little smudging, and the look was merely messy. Too much, and the intended innocence curdled into something that read as bruised or unwell. The mascara layering required patience. Each layer had to dry completely before the next was applied, a process that could take 20 minutes from first stroke to finished effect. What both versions of the eye look shared was the assumption that the eye could and should be remade rather than simply enhanced, that the natural eye shape was raw material rather than finished product, and that a woman with sufficient skill, patience, and the right set of tools could achieve something more compelling than what she had been given. This assumption, quietly radical in its implication that the self was not fixed but improvable through technique, runs through all of 1950s cosmetics culture, but it is nowhere more sharply expressed than in the meticulous, demanding art of the drawn eye. The intersection of the cat eye with race and cultural identity in the 1950s has received less historical attention than it deserves, largely because the mainstream beauty press of the period addressed itself almost exclusively to white women and treated the specific cosmetic concerns and aesthetic choices of Black and Asian and Hispanic women as either invisible or as variations on the white ideal that required special modification guidance. But the cat eye as a technique was embraced and adapted across racial communities in ways that tell a richer and more complicated story than the mainstream record suggests. Black beauty publications, including Ebony and Sepia Beauty, which circulated among African American readers throughout the decade, featured their own cat eye guidance that was adapted to the specific characteristics and aesthetic preferences of their readers. The extended winged liner technique was applied there not as an imitation of white Hollywood standards, but as a variation on an aesthetic tradition with its own history and its own internal logic, connecting to Egyptian and African cosmetic traditions, while simultaneously engaging with the contemporary moment's specific formal vocabulary. The impact of the cat eye on the decade's subsequent cultural history also deserves attention, because few beauty techniques have had a more direct and more traceable legacy. The mod eye of the mid-1960s, the exaggerated, geometric, almost cartoon-like eye makeup associated with Twiggy and the British fashion moment of that period, is a direct amplification of the 1950s wing, taking its principles of extension and elongation to their logical extreme and applying them with the harder edges and more graphic sensibility of a design culture that had moved from organic curves to sharp angles. The smoky eye of the 1970s and 80s, the grunge-inspired smudged liner of the 1990s, the graphic liner experiments of the 2010s and 20s, each of these can be traced as a modification or reaction to the architectural vocabulary of precision, extension, and deliberate visual impact that the 1950s cat eye established as the primary language of eye makeup design. The modern iteration of the cat eye, executed with gel liner or long-wear felt tip liner pens that are infinitely more forgiving than the glass bottle liquid formulations of the 1950s, has achieved what may be its widest cultural penetration in the years since the early 2000s, appearing across fashion, music, and celebrity beauty culture as a consistent reference point. The woman who executes a cat eye in 2025 is working from the same geometric logic and the same optical principles as the woman who bent over a 1953 beauty magazine diagram and worked to master the identical angle with an infinitely less user-friendly tool. The eye, as that Revlon training manual insisted, has always been the frame of the face. The mid-century's contribution was to establish, with considerable precision and some significant labour, exactly how that frame should be drawn. In 1953, the Campbell Soup Company published a promotional cookbook called A Man's World in the Kitchen, which is remarkable not for its recipes, but for the diet advice it tucked between the recipe pages, addressed entirely to women, in the confident and mildly hectoring tone that mid-century nutrition guidance consistently assumed when speaking to female readers. Among the recommendations, a glass of tomato juice before dinner to suppress appetite, a half grapefruit at breakfast to activate what the booklet called the fat-dissolving enzymes, and an instruction, italicized for emphasis, that a woman should know at all times the caloric value of everything she puts in her mouth. The booklet was free. It was distributed as a promotional item at grocery store checkout counters across the country. It was read by millions of women, and it represents, with depressing clarity, the state of American diet culture in the post-war decade. A peculiar blend of junk science, corporate interest, domestic anxiety, and the profound, structurally enforced belief that a woman's body was primarily a social object that required constant management and adjustment. The 1950s relationship between women and food is one of the most culturally contradictory episodes in American social history, and it is impossible to understand it without holding two truths simultaneously. The first is that the decade was obsessively engaged in food as pleasure and social performance. The post-war prosperity that characterized the early and middle years of the decade expressed itself, in substantial part, through the elaborate rituals of home cooking and entertaining, the dinner parties, the buffet spreads, the jello molds, the carefully orchestrated cocktail hours with their layered dips and their nut-filled celery boats, and their tiny sandwiches with the crusts cut off. The foods that appeared in this context were rich, labour-intensive, proudly indulgent, and deeply tied to the homemaker's social status. The second truth is that while all of this food was being prepared, discussed, and in many cases enthusiastically consumed, it was simultaneously surrounded by an almost constant rhetoric of restraint, directed specifically at the women who did the preparing. The message was essentially, make this lavish spread and watch everyone enjoy it, while you monitor every bite that crosses your own lips. The diet industry that had existed in a relatively small way in the 1930s and 40s exploded in the post-war decade, fueled by both a newly affluent consumer base with disposable income to spend on self-improvement and a cultural climate in which a particular body ideal had achieved genuinely hegemonic status. The silhouette that Dior's new look of 1947 had imposed on fashion, nipped waist, full hips, curved bust, the body of a woman who appeared to have been assembled with a compass and a very specific set of proportions in mind, demanded a figure that a significant proportion of American women simply did not naturally possess. Achieving it required not only the structural engineering of foundation garments, which the undergarment industry was simultaneously selling at an astonishing rate, but also the management of the body itself, which the diet industry was happy to assist with. Into this market stepped an extraordinary collection of products, programs, physicians, and outright fraudsters whose approaches to female weight management range from the merely ineffective to the genuinely dangerous. The gelatin obsession that gives this era its nickname in popular culinary history was not primarily a diet phenomenon, it was paradoxically both a diet food and a party food simultaneously. Knox unflavoured gelatin had been marketed since the 1920s, with a consistent message that its protein content made it beneficial for nails, hair, skin and figure maintenance, and this claim had accumulated enough cultural authority by the 1950s to persist long after nutritional science had established that it was largely without merit. The Jell-O company's marketing genius lay in positioning its flavoured gelatin products as simultaneously festive and figure-conscious, a party dish that was also, depending on how it was prepared, a dieter's friend. The category of the diet gelatin mould, a Jell-O preparation made with tomato juice or vegetable broth instead of water, filled with shredded cabbage or diced cucumber or celery, encased in a ring mould and presented on a bed of lettuce, occupies a genuinely strange place in American culinary history. It appeared regularly in women's magazines throughout the decade as both a diet solution and an entertaining option, suggesting that the women who prepared them might serve them to guests while signalling, through the evident discipline of the preparation, their own admirable restraint. The grapefruit diet, also known at various points in the decade as the Hollywood diet, the Mayo diet, falsely attributed to the Mayo Clinic, which had nothing to do with it, and periodically issued disclaimers to that effect, and the 18-day diet, was perhaps the single most widely circulated diet plan of the 1950s, passing hand-to-hand in handwritten copies through offices and neighbourhoods in a manner that anticipated the viral distribution of internet content by several decades. Its central premise, that grapefruit contained a specific enzyme that catalyzed the burning of fat when consumed immediately before protein, had no scientific foundation whatsoever, but it possessed the internal logic and confident specificity that characterized all effective diet mythology. The plan specified breakfast of half a grapefruit, 2 eggs, and 2 strips of bacon, lunch of half a grapefruit, a salad with any quantity of dressing and unlimited quantities of protein, dinner of half a grapefruit, any quantity of protein, vegetables cooked in butter, and coffee or tea. The sheer abundance of protein and fat in the plan was occasionally remarked upon, but was hand-waved away with the explanation that the fat-burning power of the grapefruit enzyme rendered these foods effectively calorie-neutral in combination. This was nonsense, but the plan did produce weight loss in the short term because its caloric total, despite the apparent abundance, was significantly below the average woman's maintenance calorie requirement. The weight came back the moment normal eating resumed. This cycle of temporary loss and subsequent regain was already well documented in the medical literature of the period and already well understood by the physicians who wrote about diet in popular magazines. The diet industry thrived on it regardless. The role of physicians in 1950s diet culture deserves particular attention because it illustrates the degree to which the medical profession participated in and amplified the era's problematic relationship between women and their bodies. Diet pills, amphetamine-based formulations sold under brand names including dexedrine, bifetamine, and the charmingly named Betrol, were prescribed in quantities that look extraordinary from a modern vantage point. The obesity medicine practitioners of the period, working from a definition of ideal weight that was both more restrictive and less scientifically grounded than any current standard, prescribed amphetamines to women who were by any reasonable measure within normal weight ranges, frequently in combination with diuretics that produced dramatic short-term scale movement by depleting fluid rather than reducing fat. The physical consequences of these prescriptions, racing heart, insomnia, anxiety, and the frequently devastating crash that followed cessation, were observed but often dismissed or attributed to the patient's underlying character deficiencies rather than to the medication's pharmacological effects. The calorie-counting manual that Campbell's had recommended to its promotional cookbook readers was itself a reflection of the decade's most enduring contribution to diet culture, the systematic quantification of food intake as a daily management practice. The calorie had been introduced as a scientific concept in the late 19th century, but had not achieved widespread popular currency until the 1920s, and its full cultural saturation, the point at which an ordinary American woman might be expected to know the approximate caloric content of an egg, a piece of bread, a tablespoon of mayonnaise without consulting any reference, belongs to the 1950s. The small, pocket-sized calorie counter books that proliferated throughout the decade were enormously popular, and their popularity reflects a cultural moment in which the idea that food could and should be reduced to numerical values and that the proper management of those values was a primary female responsibility, had become so thoroughly internalized as to seem obvious rather than remarkable. Seen from the present, the diet culture of the 1950s looks like what it was, a system of control dressed in the language of health and beauty, producing not healthier women but anxious ones, not better nourished bodies but more surveilled ones. What makes the era particularly complicated is that the women who participated in these diets were not passive victims of false advertising. Many of them were enthusiastic and creative participants, exchanging recipes and strategies and results with the same energy they brought to any other domestic project. The diet, like the cold cream ritual and the pin curl set, was a form of daily practice that women owned and managed, that created communities of shared knowledge and mutual support, and that produced, in the doing, a sense of agency and competence, even when the underlying premises were questionable. The women who gathered at bridge clubs to exchange grapefruit diet menus and compare results were not simply being deceived by the food industry. They were also doing something that women have always done, building communities of practice around the specific challenges their moment in history had given them. That the challenges were partly manufactured by commercial interest does not make the community less real, or the practice less meaningful. It just makes the whole picture considerably more complicated than any simple narrative of either liberation or victimhood can capture. The Metrecal phenomenon, which arrived at the very end of the decade in 1959, was perhaps the clearest indication of where all of this diet culture was heading. Mead Johnson's Metrecal was a canned liquid meal replacement, a 400-calorie vanilla or chocolate drink intended to substitute for 2 meals per day, leaving the dieter to eat only a small, sensible dinner of their choice. The product was developed by physician Willard Pennington, who had been researching liquid protein formulations for hospital use, and it found its way into the consumer market after hospital dietitians began noting that patients on liquid diets found the fixed, predetermined caloric content easier to manage than the continuous decision-making required by conventional diets. The commercial adaptation of this insight was immediate and enormous. Metrecal was the fastest-selling new product in the American packaged foods market in 1960, the year of its full national rollout, and the liquid meal replacement category it essentially created has continued in various forms and under various brand names to the present day. Its success reflected an appetite, literal and figurative, that the decades more elaborate diet rituals had created but not satisfied. The desire for a diet that removed the constant decision-making burden, that converted the complex, anxiety-inducing calculus of food choice into a single, predetermined, calorie-guaranteed act. This desire to be relieved of food decision-making is one of the most telling psychological legacies of the 1950s diet culture. A decade of continuous instruction in what to eat, when to eat it, how much of it to allow, and what the consequences of any deviation from the prescribed program would be, had produced not more nutritional confidence but less, had replaced the intuitive, embodied understanding of hunger and satisfaction that most humans possess with a constant background anxiety about whether one's current eating practices were correct, excessive, insufficient, or dangerously misaligned with whatever scientific or pseudoscientific framework one's preferred authority was currently promoting. This anxiety is not a relic of the 1950s. It is, if anything, more pronounced in the present moment, having been amplified by 60 additional years of diet industry innovation and social media's specific capacity for delivering photographic ideals at scale and velocity. The women who sat in the 1955 kitchens and counted the calories in their grapefruit halves were not, in this respect, very distant from the women who sit at breakfast tables in 2025, photographing their portion-weighed meals for followers they have never met. The specific diets have changed, the specific anxieties have evolved, but the underlying structure, the external authority, the prescribed program, the continuous surveillance of the self through the lens of the body, the hope of the transformation that is always approaching and never quite arriving, has remained remarkably stable across 7 decades. What changed most significantly between the 1950s diet culture and the present is the relationship between gender and this anxiety. The grapefruit diet and the Metrecal program were explicitly, exclusively feminine propositions. The men who appear in the photographs and advertisements of the period are eating the deviled eggs and the steak and the cream-filled pastries at the parties the women have organised. The women, whose dietary management is a constant and visible social performance, are eating the cottage cheese and the lettuce and the gelatin mould with cucumber. This division, while not entirely gone, has significantly eroded in the decades since the 1950s. The diet industry today sells equally to men, and the cultural pressure to maintain a specific body ideal has expanded considerably beyond its mid-century gender boundaries. This is not necessarily progress. It may simply be the extension of an anxiety that began as a specifically female burden to a larger population, which is expansion rather than resolution of the underlying problem. The gelatin mould is gone from most American dinner tables, but what it represented, the management of desire, the performance of restraint, the submission of appetite to social prescription, persists in forms that each new decade finds newly persuasive reasons to regard as reasonable and even desirable. The physics of a pin curl are, when you examine them carefully, quietly astonishing. A strand of human hair is composed of a protein called keratin, arranged in a helical structure that is stabilized by chemical bonds, specifically by disulfide bonds between cysteine amino acids and by the weaker hydrogen bonds that are more easily disrupted by water and heat. When a wet strand of hair is wound around a finger, positioned against the scalp, and secured with a metal clip while it dries, the hydrogen bonds that were disrupted by moisture reform in the new shape dictated by the curl, and when the clip is removed after thorough drying, the hair holds the curve because its internal structure has been temporarily but convincingly remade. The curl is not imposed on the hair from the outside. It is, in a real chemical sense, rebuilt inside the hair from the molecular level outward. The pin curl is applied chemistry enacted with metal clips and setting lotion at 10:30 in the evening by a woman whose formal education in chemistry may have ended at the 9th grade, but who has nonetheless become a highly competent practitioner of organic polymer restructuring through years of nightly experimentation on her own head. This gap between the scientific complexity of what was happening and the ordinary domestic context in which it happened is one of the most characteristic features of 1950s beauty culture, and nowhere is it more vivid than in hair setting. The American woman who set her hair in pin curls every 2 to 4 days, which by all available evidence describes a significant majority of adult women in the decade, was engaging in a practice that required genuine technical skill, accumulated experience, and a sophisticated intuitive understanding of how her own hair behaved under varying conditions of humidity, product concentration, and drying time. She was also doing this in a domestic setting, using products whose ingredients list she probably could not interpret, following techniques she had learned from her mother or her neighbour, or from the beauty pages of her preferred magazine, and regarding the whole operation as simply part of the ordinary maintenance of being a woman. There was no prestige attached to this knowledge, no professional credentialing, no recognition of its complexity. It was housekeeping of the self, as mundane and essential as ironing a blouse, and exactly as technically demanding if you wanted to do it well. The pin curl as a specific technique has a history that precedes the 1950s by several decades. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, when close to the head waves and curls were the dominant feminine hair fashion, women who could not afford regular visits to a professional hairdresser, which was the substantial majority, developed home finger wave and pin curl techniques that allowed them to replicate, approximately, the professional results they saw in magazines and on screen. The metal clip that makes a pin curl possible had been in wide commercial distribution since at least the early 1920s, and by the 30s multiple manufacturers were competing in a market for setting clips that supplied grocery stores, five-and-dime shops, and beauty supply counters across the country. The snap-on clip, the butterfly clip, the pin curl clip proper. Each had its advocates, its specific applications, its loyal users. The wave clip, which pressed hair into a curved groove rather than securing a coil, competed with pin curl clips for the affections of women who wanted smooth waves rather than bouncy curls. And the ongoing debate between wave and curl aficionados had all the passionate energy of a genuine aesthetic argument. By the time the full silhouette of 1950s femininity had crystallized in the early years of the decade, the soft waved or curled, full but controlled hairstyle that accompanied the nipped waist and the full skirt, pin curl technique had advanced considerably from its 20s origins. The setting lotion that was applied to the hair before rolling was a more sophisticated product than its predecessors. Thinned solutions of natural or synthetic polymers, frequently shellac-based or polyvinyl acetate-based, that coated each hair strand with a fine film that stiffened slightly during drying to help the curl hold its shape and resist the humidity that was a pin curl's greatest enemy. Brands like Dippity Doo, which launched in 1956 and became the category's dominant product within 2 years, and Lilt Home Permanent Setting Lotion, used as non-permanent setting aid by women who were not doing a chemical permanent, competed for a market segment that was growing every year as more women committed to the twice-weekly or even nightly setting ritual as a non-negotiable part of their grooming routine. The ritual itself had a geography that was as fixed and personal as any other intimate domestic ceremony. Most women set their hair in the bathroom or at the bedroom vanity, sometimes both. The initial dampening and product application at the sink, the setting and clipping at the mirror. The sections into which the hair was divided before rolling were not arbitrary. They were the result of accumulated personal knowledge about where the hair needed the most support, where it naturally fell with the most grace, where the scalp was prone to flatness, or where volume was required. An experienced pin curl setter could work through her entire head in under 20 minutes, sectioning, winding, and clipping with an efficiency that looked effortless because it had been achieved through hundreds of repetitions. A novice, working from the diagrams in a beauty magazine, might take an hour for a result that was technically adequate, but lacked the experienced practitioner's intuitive sense of where each curl needed to be placed to achieve the intended overall effect. The sleeping arrangement that followed setting is perhaps the most underappreciated element of the whole system, because it was genuinely uncomfortable and required a specific set of adaptations that most sources treat as afterthoughts. A head full of metal clips is not a comfortable thing to sleep on. The bobby pins and snap clips that held the curls in place pressed against the scalp during the night, and women who set their hair every night developed a range of strategies for managing this discomfort. Thin silk or rayon net hoods that cushioned the clips while allowing air circulation, specific sleeping positions that minimized pressure, pillowcases in smooth fabrics that did not catch on the clips and disturb the set. The satin pillowcase, which has recently been rediscovered by the natural hair care community as a tool for reducing friction damage, was a standard item in many homes in the 1950s specifically because of its compatibility with the setting clip routine. The morning unbinding ceremony was, if anything, even more technically demanding than the initial setting. The clips were removed in a specific sequence, not all at once, not randomly, but following the same spatial logic as the setting, working in sections that allowed the curls to support each other as they were released. A curl removed prematurely, before the hair had fully dried, would droop within minutes regardless of how carefully it had been set. The distinction between hair that was merely surface dry and hair that was genuinely dry to the core was one that experienced setters could assess by touch, running a fingertip through the center of each curl to check the temperature. Dry hair is warmer than damp hair when exposed to air for the same period, before making the decision to unclip. Once unclipped, the curls were not worn as ringlets, they were brushed out. This step, perhaps the most characteristically cinematic element of the whole process, was where the architecture of the set was either fulfilled or undone. The brushing had to be vigorous enough to blend the individual curls into a unified flowing wave or soft bounce, but controlled enough not to disturb the underlying structure that the curls had created. Too little brushing and the style looked set. Too much, and it looked frizzy, formless. The hours of nightly labour completely erased by the very act of finishing. The large boar bristle brush, which distributed the natural oils of the scalp through the hair shaft while its stiff bristles aligned the cuticle layer to produce shine, was the instrument of preference for this step, and the particular rhythm and pressure of the brushing stroke was, like every other element of the ritual, a skill developed over years of morning practice. The pin curl, properly understood, was not a hairstyle. It was a practice, a discipline, a daily commitment to a specific and demanding form of applied craft. And the women who practiced it brought to it the same serious attention that any craft deserves. The social dimensions of the pin curl ritual extended well beyond the individual woman's bathroom and into the community spaces of mid-century domestic life, in ways that are easy to overlook if one focuses exclusively on the private, nocturnal dimension of the practice. Women set each other's hair regularly, at kitchen tables over coffee cups, at bedroom vanities while their children played in the next room, at the kinds of informal domestic gatherings that characterized mid-century suburban sociality before the formalization of social life into the more structured events of the cocktail party and the dinner party. The exchange of setting technique was a form of social currency, a kind of intimate knowledge sharing that built and maintained female friendships through the particular closeness of physical proximity and mutual care. A woman who was skilled at setting curls that held perfectly, whose knowledge of product concentration and clip placement was practically trustworthy, had something genuine to offer the women around her, and the social bonds that formed around these exchanges were real and lasting. The professional salon, where women who could afford it went every week or every 2 weeks for a professional set and style, existed in an interesting complementary relationship to the home setting practice rather than in opposition to it. The salon visit, under the loud, warm, chemically scented dome of a standing dryer, a magazine in the lap, conversation proceeding in the peculiar half-private, half-public register of the salon space, was a social institution with its own culture and its own community. The neighbourhood beauty shop, operated by a proprietor who knew her regulars as intimately as any professional confidant, was a gathering place whose function was both practical and social, and its specific combination of physical care, community conversation, and temporary respite from domestic obligations made it an important institution in women's lives that the home setting practice could supplement but not entirely replace. The chemical permanent wave, the Tony Home Permanent, launched in 1947 and one of the most commercially successful beauty products in post-war American history, or the competing Lilt and Richard Hudnut wave set, existed as a different kind of intervention in hair structure, one that went beyond the temporary hydrogen bond restructuring of the wet set to produce a longer-lasting curl through the breaking and reforming of the hair's disulfide bonds. The Home Permanent had its own elaborate ritual, its own specific product sequence. The waving lotion applied to wound rods, the neutralizer applied after the waving period to restabilize the bonds in their new configuration, and its own community of practitioners who exchanged tips about timing, rod size, and the specific management of the chemical process at the same kitchen tables where pin curl setting was discussed. What distinguished the permanent from the wet set was its semi-permanence and its consequent relationship to time. Where the pin curl set had to be done every 2 to 4 days and was therefore a constant feature of the weekly domestic rhythm, the permanent wave was done every 6 to 10 weeks and functioned as a kind of seasonal marker, a periodic renewal of the basic structure from which the daily setting work began. The connection between all of this hairwork and the broader project of mid-century feminine self-presentation was both practical and philosophical. The hair was perhaps the most visually conspicuous single element of a woman's appearance, more variable, more immediately responsive to weather and activity and mood than either face or dress, and its consistent, controlled maintenance was read by the mid-century social world as evidence of a general orderliness and reliability of character that extended well beyond the superficial. The woman whose hair was always properly set, who arrived at church or the grocery store or the office with her curls freshly brushed and perfectly placed, was understood to be the kind of woman who kept things in order, whose household was clean, whose children were well managed, whose domestic responsibilities were competently met. The hair was the visible evidence of the invisible labour, and the invisible labour was the invisible labour of being a woman of the 1950s in full standing. The pin curl was never only about beauty, it was about identity, about community, about the daily disciplined performance of a specific and demanding social role. That the performance required such extraordinary technical commitment is exactly what made it, in its own way, admirable. In 1954, the Patricia Stevens Finishing School Network, which operated in over 40 American cities and had been consistently profitable since its founding in 1945, released a promotional brochure that listed in careful typeset columns the specific skills its students would acquire over the course of a 12-week program. The list runs to 63 itemized competencies, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because its very comprehensiveness illuminates something important about what charm school actually was in the post-war American cultural landscape. Among the 63 items, the correct angle at which to tilt the head when meeting a stranger of superior social standing, the maximum appropriate volume for a woman's laugh in a mixed social setting, the brochure specifies audible to the immediate table but not to the adjacent one, the precise number of seconds that should elapse between the acceptance of a compliment and the response to it, the specific wrist position that indicates attentive listening without appearing submissive, and the recommended diameter of the smile appropriate for a formal introduction versus the one appropriate for a chance encounter with an acquaintance on a public sidewalk. The brochure does not describe these as matters of opinion or personal style. It describes them as facts, as objectively correct behaviours that the Patricia Stevens program would impart, as a carpenter imparts correct joinery technique, to women who had been making the mistake of navigating social life with only their own natural judgment to guide them. This confidence, this absolute conviction that there was a correct way to stand, to smile, to enter a room, to hold a teacup, is the defining characteristic of mid-century finishing school culture, and understanding it requires some historical context. The American charm school and finishing house tradition had roots in the 19th century European finishing school model, which had existed primarily to prepare upper-class girls for their formal social debut and the consequent marriage market. But the American version that flourished in the post-war decade was something quite different, a democratized, commercially oriented institution that was explicitly not about class status but about class performance, about equipping women of middle and working-class backgrounds with the external behaviours associated with the upper-middle-class social world they aspired to enter or already inhabited. The Patricia Stevens and John Robert Powers and Barbizon modelling schools that proliferated in American cities in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s positioned themselves not as finishing schools in the aristocratic sense, but as charm and modelling academies, offering programs that promised confidence, social facility, and in the best cases, actual modelling or promotional work to their graduates. The distinction between the academic curriculum of a finishing school and the marketing proposition of a modelling academy was, in practice, often non-existent. Whether the brochure said charm school or modelling academy or personal development program, the actual content of most 12 to 16-week courses was strikingly similar. Posture, movement, social etiquette, makeup application, wardrobe management, voice modulation, and a component that was frequently described as personality development and amounted to an intensive course in performing a particular version of femininity with fluency, consistency, and apparent naturalness. The posture component was genuinely foundational, and its methods were more physically demanding than most retrospective accounts acknowledge. The book on the head exercise that has become the shorthand symbol for all of finishing school culture was not merely a charming parlour trick. It was a calibration tool for teaching students to maintain cervical spine alignment while in motion, specifically while walking in heels on various surfaces, entering and exiting seated positions, and turning corners in full-length skirts or pencil skirts of varying degrees of restriction. Walking correctly in the constraints of 1950s fashion required specific muscular coordination. The kitten heels and stilettos that dominated the decade's footwear required weight distribution patterns, very different from flat or low-heeled shoes, and the pencil skirt, which took hold decisively in the mid-decade years, demanded a specific stride adjustment, shorter steps, initiated from the hip rather than the knee, that was genuinely counterintuitive for women accustomed to walking in fuller silhouettes. The schools that taught these adjustments were not teaching vanity. They were teaching biomechanics to women whose professional and social environments required them to move through the world in a specific physical vocabulary, for which most of them had received no formal instruction. The etiquette curriculum occupied a particularly interesting position in the charm school program because it operated in a cultural moment when the specific social codes of the pre-war American upper class were simultaneously dissolving under the pressure of post-war social mobility and being anxiously reconstructed in modified form for a new class of aspirants. The detailed guidance on introductions, who was introduced to whom, in what order, with what exact phrasing, in what physical arrangement, was based on a system of social precedents that had been codified in the early 20th century, and was already by the 1950s somewhat archaic in its assumption of fixed hierarchies. But the charm schools taught it anyway, and their students absorbed it, because the anxiety of not knowing the rule was greater than the actual practical risk of violating it. The rules functioned primarily as anxiety management, as a source of behavioural certainty in a social world that felt perpetually uncertain to women navigating class transitions, new suburban communities, and the intensified social performance demands of a decade obsessed with appearances. The conversational component of the curriculum was perhaps the most revealing. Charm school courses in conversation did not teach women to be interesting. They taught women to make other people feel interesting, to ask questions, to listen with apparent attentiveness, to steer exchanges towards subjects on which the other person had strong opinions, and then create space for those opinions to be expressed. The art of steering, as it was sometimes called in more candid instructional materials, was the practice of redirecting a conversation that had moved into dangerous territory, politically contentious subjects, financial specifics, personal matters unsuitable for the occasion, through a graceful pivot that the other person was not meant to notice. This was presented as a social skill, and in one sense it absolutely was. In another sense, it was training in a specific form of social subordination. The performance of interest in others in place of the expression of interest in oneself, the silencing of one's own opinions in the service of the conversational comfort of people whose opinions one was supposed to defer to. It would be too simple, however, to read the charm school phenomenon purely as a mechanism of female suppression. The women who enrolled in these programs and the women who operated them were frequently doing something considerably more complex than submitting to patriarchal behavioral codes. Many of the schools were owned and run by women. Patricia Stevens herself was a formidable businesswoman who built a franchise operation across 4 decades. The instructors who taught the courses were in many cases experienced professionals, former models, actresses, department store buyers, executives, who had navigated the social world of the 1950s with great effectiveness and were passing on operational intelligence that had genuine practical value. For a young woman from a working-class background who was trying to present herself successfully in an office environment where class markers were scrutinized and where behavioral errors could have genuine professional consequences, the specific, detailed instruction that a charm school offered was not trivial or merely cosmetic. It was practical social capital, learnable and transferable in ways that naturally inherited social ease was not. The enduring cultural image of the charm school, the white gloves, the books balanced on heads, the demure smiles, the practiced handshakes, obscures a more interesting reality. The finishing school was, among other things, a place where women took themselves seriously enough to submit their social behaviour to systematic analysis and deliberate improvement. The goal of that improvement was frequently conformity rather than distinction, and the specific forms of conformity being taught were frequently limiting rather than liberating. But the underlying premise, that social skill is learnable, that one's presence in the world can be cultivated and refined through conscious practice, that the gap between who you are and who you present yourself as being is a space that can be actively managed, is not a premise that belongs uniquely to repressive decades. It belongs to any moment in which people are trying to navigate a social world that is more complex, more demanding, and more consequential than the one they started from. The voice work that formed a component of many charm school curricula is among the most interesting and least documented aspects of the finishing education. The American female voice of the 1950s was the subject of considerable cultural attention. The too loud voice, the too regional voice, the voice pitched too high in excitement or too flat in affect. And the speech components of charm programs addressed these concerns with a clinical directness that modern sensibilities find either bracing or intrusive depending on one's perspective. Students were recorded on the emerging technology of the magnetic tape recorder, played back their own voices, and given specific technical feedback about pitch, pace, volume, and the elimination of regional accents that were considered to be barriers to professional and social mobility in the homogenized national culture that mid-century media was creating. The aspiration of a voice that placed its speaker nowhere, that was unlocatable by region, by class, by ethnicity, was the aspiration of a neutral, broadcast-quality speech that the emerging television medium was simultaneously normalizing as a standard of educated American English. The instruction in voice and speech was not entirely about elimination and correction. The better programs also taught positive techniques, how to modulate pitch for emphasis without sounding theatrical, how to use pacing to suggest authority without sounding deliberate, how to produce the quality of warmth in spoken interaction that made other people feel attended to and valued. These were skills with genuine social utility, and the women who learned them used them with real effect in the social and professional contexts they moved through. The distinction between the voice and conversational skills that charm schools taught and what might today be called emotional intelligence is one of degree rather than kind. The era's version of these skills was more prescriptive, more allied with specific social hierarchies, and less oriented toward the internal experience of the practitioner than contemporary frameworks tend to be. But the underlying recognition that social interaction is a domain in which skill matters, in which learning and deliberate practice can produce better outcomes than pure instinct, is the same. The decline of the charm school in its classic mid-century form was gradual rather than sudden. The first significant challenge came from the early second-wave feminist movement of the late 1960s, which identified the finishing school's curriculum as a particularly direct form of the social training that limited women to ornamental and domestic roles. By the early 1970s, enrollment in the Patricia Stevens and Barbizon programs had declined substantially, and many branches had closed or pivoted toward different programming, self-development courses, career preparation workshops, the modelling and acting pipeline that had always been a component of the business, but had previously been secondary to the charm instruction. The Barbizon School transformed most completely, becoming by the 1980s primarily a talent management and representation operation focused on modelling and acting. The finishing school component essentially absorbed into or eliminated by the professional training that replaced it. What remained, and what has, if anything, expanded in the decades since, is the underlying recognition that presentation, physical, verbal, social, is a learnable skill set with real consequences for professional and social outcomes. The executive presence coaching that occupies in the 21st century a cultural position somewhat analogous to the 1950s charm school is less gender-specific in its targeting, more likely to frame its instruction in the language of leadership effectiveness than of social grace, and less likely to teach the correct angle of a head tilt when meeting a superior. But the fundamental premise, that there is a way of carrying oneself in the world that communicates competence and confidence and invites trust, and that this way can be taught and learned, is the same premise that Patricia Stevens was selling from her salon chairs in 1945. The charm school's particular mid-century form is long gone. Its underlying argument has proven considerably more durable than its detractors in any decade have generally been willing to acknowledge. There is a Stratton compact in the Victoria and Albert Museum's collection of 20th century decorative objects that was acquired not from an estate sale or an antique dealer, but from a London bus driver who found it wedged between the seat cushions of a double-decker in 1987. By that point it was at least 30 years old, possibly older, a Stratton floral, the collector's designation for a series produced between approximately 1948 and 1959 featuring hand-enamelled floral panels in a raised enamel technique on gilt or silver plate cases. Inside, the mirror was uncracked, the powder puff still attached to its interior clip with a satin ribbon. The pressed powder intact, though dried at the edges in the way that all pressed powder eventually dries when the compact is sealed and neglected over decades. Someone had carried this object on a London bus sometime in the 1950s, and it had slipped from her handbag and been lost, and 30 years later it was notable enough in its construction and beauty that a bus driver thought it worth preserving rather than discarding. The object tells a story about mid-century compact culture that no advertisement or product catalogue can quite capture, that these things were made to last, were made to be beautiful, were made with a level of craft attention that treated a 3-inch powder case as a worthy object of genuine artistic investment. The powder compact's status as a genuinely serious collectible object was established by the 1950s through a long process of commercial and cultural development that began roughly in the 1920s. Before the widespread adoption of compressed powder technology in the early 20th century, loose powder was the standard, applied from a box with a large puff, a messy process that required distance from formal settings and produced results that were inconsistent and difficult to manage in public. The development of pressed powder technology, which bound face powder with small quantities of binders and oils into a coherent portable cake that could be applied with a small puff without scattering, created the precondition for the compact as a social object. Once powder could be carried in a small case, the case became a social accessory, and once it became a social accessory, the case became a canvas. The English firm of Stratton, based in Birmingham, was by the early 1950s the premier manufacturer of quality compacts for the international market. The company had been founded in 1941, which is a striking moment for the launch of a luxury cosmetics accessory company. Britain was in the second year of the Blitz, and the materials required for decorative metalwork, particularly the brass, gilt metal, and enamel compounds that Stratton used in its manufacturing, were all subject to wartime restrictions. Stratton navigated this by establishing early relationships with the British Board of Trade and by positioning its product explicitly as a morale object. The compact is an instrument of feminine dignity and psychological resilience in difficult circumstances, which was not entirely a cynical argument, given the documented role that cosmetics maintenance played in women's wartime morale throughout the industrialized nations. By the time the war ended and material restrictions lifted, Stratton had both the manufacturing capability and the product development infrastructure to move into the peacetime market with considerable speed, and the late 1940s and early 1950s were the company's most prolific and artistically ambitious period. The aesthetic vocabulary of the Stratton Compact at its post-war peak was remarkably diverse. The product range encompassed engine-turned geometric patterns, the precise, interlocking diamonds and guilloche designs that referenced the engraving techniques of Fabergé and other luxury goldsmiths, alongside the hand-applied enamel floral panels that became the company's most distinctive and most collected designs. The production of the hand-enameled pieces involved skilled craft workers who applied multiple layers of vitreous enamel to metal panels, each layer fired separately at high temperatures, with the floral motifs built up through a combination of flooding and fine-line technique that produced depth and translucency in the finished surface. This was not a production line process in any simple sense. It was artisanal manufacture scaled to commercial quantities through the employment of workers with genuinely specialized skills, and the results, the vivid violets, the layered roses, the sprays of lily of the valley rendered in cream and gold enamel on a midnight blue ground, are objects of genuine decorative art that hold up against any comparison the modern observer cares to make. The American market received Stratton compacts primarily through department store cosmetics counters, where they were sold either empty or pre-filled with powder and presented as gifts alongside other luxury cosmetics items. They competed in this market with domestic manufacturers including Volupté, which had been producing decorative compacts from its New Jersey factories since the 1930s and whose signature designs, including the famous hand compact shaped like a realistically detailed hand with painted fingernails, and the various novelty compacts shaped like musical instruments, animals and nautical objects, were among the most recognizable and collectible American compact designs of the mid-century period. There was also the Evans Manufacturing Company, whose tap-sift powder compact, featuring a hinged mesh sifter that allowed controlled dispensation of loose powder through a compressed powder mechanism, was a genuine mechanical innovation and a substantial commercial success. And there was the Richard Hudnut Company, whose compact line was positioned somewhat below the Stratton and Volupté price points, but whose designs were frequently elegant, and whose products appeared regularly on department store vanity displays alongside the higher-priced imports. The etiquette of the compact in public social settings was a subject of remarkable specificity in mid-century comportment guides, and the rules that governed when and how a woman might use her compact in company reveal a great deal about the cultural status of the object. The fundamental principle was that powder, unlike lipstick, could be applied in most public settings without appearing vain or attention-seeking. Provided the gesture was managed with sufficient discretion, the compact opened at an angle that did not direct the mirror toward other people, the puff applied with a light-controlled pat rather than a visible full-face application. The compact closed and returned to the handbag in a single fluid gesture. Lipstick, by contrast, required a private setting for full reapplication, though a quick touch-up at a restaurant table was permissible if executed quickly and without theatre. The nose, specifically, could be powdered anywhere that was not a formal dinner table. The chin required more discretion. The full face was a bathroom-only procedure. These distinctions, arcane as they appear from a distance of 70 years, reflected a coherent underlying principle that the act of maintenance was permissible to witness in small doses, but that the full spectacle of the face being constructed was a private matter, something that happened in private space, and that the public was not entitled to observe. The handbag that carried the compact was its natural domestic partner, and the relationship between bag and compact was itself a source of considerable cultural attention. The Judith Leiber and Corette handbags of the period, small, structured evening bags in leather or brocade that had defined interior compartments specifically sized for a compact, a lipstick, and a handkerchief, were designed around the compact's dimensions as much as the other way around. A compact that did not fit comfortably in one's evening bag was a compact that had failed at its primary social function, and the sizing of commercial compacts throughout the decade reflects an awareness of this constraint. The 2.5-inch diameter compact, which fits comfortably in the palm of the hand and in most standard evening bag compartments, was and remained the dominant size format precisely because it sat at the intersection of adequate powder capacity and maximum portability. Today, the mid-century compact has the second life of all well-made decorative objects. The antique market, the dedicated collector community, the Instagram account of someone whose shelves hold 50 of them arranged by enamel colour. Stratton compacts in particular have a dedicated collector community that spans multiple continents and maintains the kind of meticulous provenance knowledge, which patterns appeared in which years, which enamel combinations are rare, which dealer marks indicate genuine vintage production as opposed to later reproduction, that any serious collecting field develops around its most desirable objects. What makes this community particularly interesting is its demographic. It is overwhelmingly composed of women who are drawn not only to the object's aesthetic qualities, but to what the objects represent. A moment in history when a woman's most intimate daily tool was considered worthy of the same craft investment as any other decorative art. There is something in that consideration, that respect for the small daily object and the daily ritual it served, that resonates far beyond the historical moment that produced it. The practice of collecting mid-century compacts has its own particular community culture, one that developed in the antique markets and estate sales of the 1970s and 80s as the post-war generation of compact owners began to pass their objects on through inheritance and estate dispersal. The earliest serious collectors tended to be dealers who had noticed that certain compacts, the Stratton enamel pieces, the Volupte novelties, the Evans tap sift in its various configurations, commanded significant price premiums over ordinary costume jewellery and accessory items at estate auctions and flea markets. These dealers built networks of suppliers and clients, created rudimentary price guides based on observed transactions, and began the patient, cumulative work of establishing the collecting field's basic taxonomy. Which makers were most desirable? Which periods within each maker's production history were most sought after? Which conditions, the compact that retains its original interior fittings, its original puff, even its original powder cake, commanded the significant premiums over examples that had been cleaned, refitted, or separated from their original contents? The price at which a genuinely rare mid-century compact can trade in the current collector market would surprise most people who regard these objects primarily as decorative curiosities. The most desirable Stratton hand-enamelled pieces, particularly those from the early 1950s, with complex multicolour floral panels in excellent condition with original interiors, regularly appear at specialist auction houses at prices between £500 and £2,000 sterling. Documented examples with strong provenance, or the small number of signed artist pieces that Stratton produced for limited distribution, can exceed these figures considerably. The Volupte famous hand compact, in the gilt version with painted fingernails in good condition, trades between $300 and $600 at American auction. These are not insignificant prices for objects that were originally sold for a few dollars in a department store cosmetics department, and they reflect the combined action of scarcity, the natural attrition of decades of use, loss, and disposal having reduced the supply of fine examples substantially, and the growing recognition of mid-century decorative arts as a genuine collecting category with its own scholarship, its own price history, and its own authoritative references. The scholarship that surrounds compact collecting is itself worth noting, because it represents a form of material culture history that takes seriously the objects that women carried in their handbags, the things that passed through their hands daily, as worthy subjects of the same analytical and archival attention that more traditionally prestigious categories of decorative art have always commanded. Rosalind Gerson's Vintage Ladies Compacts, published in the 1990s, and the most comprehensive reference work the field has produced, documents thousands of examples with production history, maker attribution, and market guidance. And it reflects a broader movement in material culture studies toward taking gendered objects, the things specifically associated with women's daily lives, as seriously as the weapons, tools, and public monuments that have traditionally dominated historical collections. The compact in this context is not a minor curiosity. It is evidence, beautifully made, intimately used, surprisingly durable evidence of how mid-century women moved through the world, what they carried with them, and what they considered worth carrying beautifully. The chapter on cocktail party planning in Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette, first published in 1952 and reprinted in over 20 editions over the following decade, opens with a sentence that has the quality of a moral pronouncement. The cocktail party is one of the most democratic of social forms, and therefore one of the most easily mismanaged. What Vanderbilt means by democratic is specific. Unlike a formal dinner party, which requires matched tableware and extensive cooking skill, and a dining room large enough to seat all guests simultaneously, a cocktail party can theoretically be given by anyone with a reasonably appointed living room, a well-stocked bar cart, and the social intelligence to manage the flow of people through a space without a fixed seating arrangement to impose order. This apparent accessibility is precisely what makes it dangerous, Vanderbilt argues, because the absence of structural constraints means that any failures of planning and management become entirely visible, entirely attributable to the hostess, and entirely impossible to disguise. This anxiety about the cocktail party as a social form, the equal and opposite forces of its democratic openness, and its consequent exposure of the hostess to judgment, runs through virtually every mid-century guide to domestic entertaining, and it reflects something important about the cultural status of the suburban homemaker in the post-war decade. The home had been positioned by the dominant rhetoric of the era as the woman's sphere, her domain of expertise and expression, the place where her skills and taste and social intelligence were most fully displayed and most directly evaluated. This positioning was simultaneously an honour and an enormous pressure. The cocktail party, where 12 or 20 or 30 guests circulated through the public rooms of the house for 2 to 3 hours, while the hostess simultaneously managed the bar, the food, the conversation flow, the pacing of the evening, and the social dynamics between guests who might not know each other well, was one of the most demanding tests of everything that the decade expected a competent homemaker to be. The bar cart itself, that particular piece of furniture that appears in the background of so many mid-century photographs, and has become one of the most recognisable signifiers of the era in contemporary interior design revivals, was both a functional apparatus and a social statement. Its contents were not casual or improvised. They were curated according to specific principles that reflected both genuine hospitality concerns and a fairly elaborate set of social codes about what drinks a respectable household offered and in what proportions. The standard mid-century bar cart stock, as specified in entertaining guides from the period, included Scotch whisky, bourbon, rye whisky, gin, vodka, which was just beginning its American ascent driven heavily by Smirnoff's marketing, dry and sweet vermouth, rum, and a selection of mixers, club soda, ginger ale, tonic water, tomato juice, wine, which has now entirely displaced spirits as the American middle-class entertaining drink of choice, appeared on the bar carts of the 1950s almost as an afterthought, a concession to guests with European tastes rather than a central element of the beverage programme. The cocktail glasses that accompanied this bar cart were matters of genuine material concern. Crystal stemware had been a luxury consumer category throughout the pre-war period, but had become, in the post-war years, an accessible aspiration for the growing American middle class, and the mid-decade years saw a proliferation of crystal and crystal effect glass lines at price points ranging from the genuinely luxurious Waterford, Baccarat, Stuart Crystal to the very affordable pressed glass imitations sold in department stores under their house brands. The specific glasses required for a properly equipped cocktail setup were themselves a subject of instruction. The old-fashioned glass, correctly proportioned at approximately 8 to 10 ounces, with a heavy base that allowed muddling. The highball glass, taller and lighter, used for long drinks with significant mixer content. The cocktail glass, the inverted cone on a stem that is now universally called a martini glass regardless of what it contains, properly appropriate for drinks served straight up without ice. The champagne coupe, shallow and round, for sparkling wine, and for the elaborate fruit juice and sherbet punches that were a staple of the era's feminine entertaining. Each glass was washed in a specific manner. Hand-washing with hot water and a small amount of white vinegar was specified in more rigorous guides as the only method that produced the necessary streak-free clarity. Polished with a linen cloth while still warm and stored rim-up in a glass cabinet where it would neither accumulate dust on the inside nor be accessible to fingerprints. The food that accompanied the cocktail hour was governed by a philosophy of restraint that operated in interesting tension with the general mid-century appetite for abundance. The principle was that cocktail food should stimulate appetite rather than satisfy it. Each individual piece should be small enough to eat in 1 or 2 bites, should be interesting enough to provoke pleasure without requiring concentration, and should be designed to complement rather than compete with the drinks being served. The deviled egg, which achieved its maximum cultural moment in the 1950s, exemplifies this philosophy perfectly. Half a hard-boiled egg, the yolk removed combined with mayonnaise, mustard, and whatever seasoning the hostess preferred, piped or spooned back into the white, garnished with paprika, and frequently with a sliver of olive or pimento. One bite, or two if the guest was decorous. Technically undemanding, but requiring genuine attention to proportion and seasoning. Elegant in its simplicity without being boring. Endlessly customizable, devoid of the structural challenges, dripping, crumbling, requiring cutlery, that made some party foods socially inconvenient. The anchovy paste on toast rounds, the stuffed celery boats, the water chestnuts wrapped in bacon and secured with a toothpick and baked. These were not accidental selections. They were the results of a calculation that the best mid-century entertaining guides made explicit. The hostess must consider not only flavour, but manageability, not only visual appeal, but the mechanics of consumption in a standing conversational context. Food that required two hands was an error, because a hand holding food was a hand unavailable for a glass, which forced the guest into an awkward and unsatisfying choice. Food that dripped was a catastrophe in a living room, where the furniture could not be damaged, and where the hostess was not available to immediately address accidents. Food that crumbled was nearly as bad. The successful cocktail food was food that could be lifted, consumed, and disposed of with one hand and one smooth motion, while the guest maintained eye contact with the person they were speaking to, and gave no outward sign that they were doing something as mundane as eating. Beneath all of this meticulous planning lay a management challenge that the entertaining guides addressed in the language of social craft, but that was in reality a demanding exercise in spontaneous social orchestration, the conversation itself. The cocktail party, unlike the dinner party, produced no natural conversational structure. Without a seating arrangement to determine who spoke to whom and in what sequence, without a shared meal to provide a common focus, without a formal agenda to impose order, the social dynamics of a cocktail party were entirely dependent on the hostess's ability to read the room, identify where conversations were flourishing and where they were stalling, introduce people to each other with the kind of specific, interesting contextual detail that gave them something to talk about, and extricate guests from conversational situations that were clearly not working. The etiquette guides provided scripts for introductions, the specific wording that turned a simple "my husband Jim," "meet my neighbour Carol" into a facilitated social connection that gave both parties a conversational opening. And these scripts were not decorative. They were functional tools for managing the social machinery of the room. The women who mastered the mid-century cocktail hour were performing a genuinely complex social service, and the very invisibility of their management, the fact that a well-run cocktail party looked effortless, as though the canapés had arranged themselves and the conversations had found their own natural warmth, was the clearest evidence of skill. The hostess who had done her work well was the hostess who was indistinguishable from her guests, circulating without apparent purpose, conversing without apparent effort, and producing through patient and intelligent labour an experience that felt like spontaneous social pleasure rather than the result of weeks of planning and execution. That this labour was expected, was assumed, and went largely unacknowledged is one of the mid-century's most characteristic social arrangements. That the women who performed it did so with genuine artistry and genuine pride is one of its most under-discussed facts. The geography of the drink service itself was a matter of considerable strategic thought in the better guides to cocktail party management. The bar cart could not be positioned at the centre of the room. This created a bottleneck as guests clustered around it waiting for service and blocked the conversational flow that the hostess was trying to maintain. Nor could it be placed in an isolated corner, which forced guests to make a deliberate journey for refills and created an air of ration rather than abundance that was inconsistent with the event's hospitality goals. The preferred position was at one end of the main entertaining room, accessible without conspicuousness, and the guidance was that the hostess or a designated family member should position themselves sufficiently close to the bar at intervals throughout the evening to facilitate the natural drift toward it that occurred when conversation flagged and guests needed a purposeful activity to fill the brief social gap. The bar, in this formulation, was as much a social lubricant as its contents, a reason for guests to move, to encounter new conversational partners, to exercise a small degree of agency in an otherwise managed social situation. The question of who was doing the bartending was itself a site of some social complexity in the mid-century entertaining literature. The consensus across most guides was that the host, the husband, should mix and serve drinks, as this gave him a defined social role and a conversational anchor, while the hostess circulated freely, attending to food and guests. This division was both practical and symbolic. It placed the husband in the position of provider and the wife in the position of social facilitator. The structure of their professional domestic partnership mapped onto the social event in miniature. But in practice, many mid-century couples negotiated this quite differently, and the guides themselves acknowledged variations. The husband, who was unsociable at parties and needed the bar assignment to prevent him from retreating into silence. The wife, who was the more natural mixologist, and for whom the bar management was genuinely preferable to the social circulation that wore her out. The prescriptive literature and the lived reality of mid-century entertaining were, as in all things, more complicated and more various than the neatly gendered instruction suggested. The morning after a cocktail party was in its own way as revealing as the event itself. The post-party debrief, the assessment of what had worked and what had not, which conversations had flourished and which had been awkward, whether the canapés had been consumed in the right proportions, whether any glass had been broken, whether the couple the hostess had hoped would get along had in fact gotten along, was conducted between spouses in the kitchen over coffee cups, while the ashtrays from the evening were emptied and the crystal was carefully washed. This post-event analysis was not casual social chatter. It was genuine operational review, the kind of systematic assessment of what had worked and what needed adjustment that any professional event manager would recognise. The mid-century hostess was, in this sense, a professional operating without a professional's title or compensation, applying genuine managerial skill to a domain that was regarded by the culture that demanded it of her as a natural feminine gift rather than an earned competency. The cocktail hour, properly understood, was one of the most complex professional performances that the decade regularly demanded from women, and the glass of sherry that the hostess permitted herself after the last guest had gone home was not indulgence. It was the recovery of a worker who had been working very hard indeed. There is a passage in Vogue's 1955 Book of Etiquette, written by Millicent Fenwick, that would be extraordinary in any other context but reads, in its own, as entirely matter-of-fact. A well-dressed woman is one whose clothing never calls attention to itself, but only to her. It is a sentence that requires some unpacking, because its apparent simplicity conceals an enormous philosophical prescription. To dress in a way that draws attention to clothing rather than to the person wearing it was, in this formulation, a failure of taste that amounted almost to a social error, an error of excess, of conspicuousness, of trying too hard in a way that exposed the effort behind the appearance and therefore undermined the entire performance. The woman who dressed correctly was the woman who had so thoroughly mastered the construction of her public self that the scaffolding was invisible, the seams non-existent, the architecture undiscoverable beneath the graceful, apparently effortless totality of her presentation. The scaffolding, however, was very much there. The 1950s silhouette that Vogue was advising its readers to achieve through invisible means was one of the most structurally complex and layered clothing systems in the history of Western dress, and understanding it requires starting from the skin outward, which is exactly where the women who wore it started, because the foundation garments that sat closest to the body were the armature on which every subsequent layer depended for its line, its fit, and its social legibility. The girdle, not the steel-boned corset of the Victorian period, which had been largely abandoned by the 1920s, but the more flexible but no less controlling elasticized foundation garment that Warner's, Maidenform, Playtex and Burley competed to produce in mid-century, was standard wear for virtually all adult women throughout the decade, regardless of their natural figure. Industry surveys from the period indicate that the proportion of American women who wore a girdle daily was well above 80% in the early and middle years of the decade, declining only slightly toward the end as a younger generation began to question the necessity of the garment. The social pressure that drove this statistic was not simply about appearance, it was about propriety. To move without a girdle, to allow the natural mobility of the body's flesh to be visible through the skirts and trousers of the period, was considered a form of indecency by the standards of the time, a failure of self-presentation that bordered on the immodest. Women in professional settings reported being corrected by supervisors. Women in domestic settings reported social ostracism from neighbours who could apparently detect, through some attentive monitoring of the visual evidence, the absence of a foundation garment. The girdle that most women wore was not a single garment, but a system. The basic panty girdle, which extended from waist to upper thigh, and was constructed from panels of elastic and lycra-like fabrics, bonded together for differential compression, was frequently augmented with a separate long-line bra, the brassiere that extended below the natural bust line, with additional boning along the torso to create a smooth, uninterrupted line from shoulder to hip. Together, these two garments created the compressed, streamlined foundation that the decade's fashions required. The full-skirted new-look silhouette needed a smooth hip line and a rigidly defined waist, which the girdle and long-line bra provided. The emerging pencil skirt silhouette, which required an even smoother hip line with no visible indentation or unevenness at the panty line, required the same foundation adjusted for the different visual demands of a fitted rather than full skirt. Neither silhouette was achievable, for most bodies, without the foundation garments that created the required proportional illusion. This was understood, accepted, and entirely unremarkable. The physical discomfort of the garments was simply a given of being dressed correctly, as unremarkable as the discomfort of high heels. The petticoat and crinoline that filled out the full-skirted silhouette were the era's most exuberant structural elements, and their construction received a level of domestic attention that has been largely forgotten. The most functional petticoats of the early and mid-decade were multiple layered constructions of stiffened nylon net, bouffant petticoats that could support the remarkable volume that the new-look silhouette required without the weight and bulk of the crinoline hoops that had produced similar effects in the 1850s. A good petticoat had 3 to 5 layers of net, each slightly longer than the one above it to create maximum lift at the hem, and was starched, either commercially or at home with liquid starch applied by spray or by immersion, to a stiffness that allowed it to maintain its bell shape without continuous support from the wearer's movement. The home starching of petticoats was a regular domestic chore in households where full skirts were worn daily, and the technique required some expertise. Too little starch, and the net went limp within hours. Too much, and the petticoat became uncomfortably scratchy against the skin, and crackled audibly during movement, which was a social exposure of the construction that the decade's aesthetics explicitly forbade. The dress or skirt that sat over this foundation system was itself a precision-engineered object. The better ready-to-wear garments of the period, produced by labels including Jonathan Logan, Kay Windsor and Tina Lisa at the middle and upper ends of the ready-to-wear market, were constructed with a level of attention to internal structure that modern casual wear has entirely abandoned. Interfaced bodices provided the stiffening that kept the structure of the garment independent of the body inside it. Boned bodices in more formal garments replicated within the dress itself some of the shaping function of the foundation garments beneath. Hidden plackets concealed zipper closures at the back or side seam. Horsehair hem tape weighted the skirt hem to produce a precise controlled swing. The construction of a well-made 1950s dress was the construction of a small architectural object, and the women who wore them were encased in multiple concentric layers of structural engineering. The accessories that completed this architecture were not decorative afterthoughts. They were integral to the system's logic. Gloves were perhaps the most culturally freighted accessory of the decade, and their presence or absence, their length and their colour, their material and their condition, communicated social information with a precision that most modern observers struggle to recover. White cotton gloves in short length, wrist or just above, were the standard daytime accessory for most occasions, cleaned after each wearing and replaced at the first sign of wear at the palm or fingertip seams, because visibly worn gloves were an indication not of poverty but of insufficient attention to detail, which was worse. Longer gloves, elbow length or above elbow, were evening wear in kid leather or fabric matching the dress, and their presence transformed an outfit from daytime to formal evening more reliably than any other single element. The protocol governing when gloves were worn and when they were removed at specific points during social events was detailed, widely known, and rigorously observed in formal settings. The handbag, the shoes, and the hat completed the daytime ensemble, and the matching imperative, the expectation that these 3 elements would coordinate in colour and material if not in precise match, was one of the decade's most specific and most observed style rules. The navy shoe with the navy bag, the black pump with the black clutch, the tan patent leather with the camel-coloured bag, these were not creative choices so much as correct solutions to a prescribed problem, and the woman who arrived at an event with a handbag that did not coordinate with her shoes had made an error that other women would notice, would register, and would in some cases remember. This may seem like an extreme social burden applied to a matter of no moral consequence, and from a modern vantage point it clearly is. But within the logic of the decade's social world, where appearance was understood as a direct expression of character, where the care taken with one's clothing was read as evidence of the care taken with one's responsibilities, and where every element of the dressed self communicated membership in or exclusion from the social class one aspired to occupy, the matching bag and shoe were not trivial. They were a form of social language, and speaking it correctly was a skill that required consistent attention and deliberate maintenance. The hat deserves its own moment of attention in any account of mid-century women's dress, because its decline, dramatic, almost total, occurring within less than a decade in the early 1960s, marks one of the most significant single shifts in the visual culture of American femininity, and is one of the earliest and clearest signals of the broader dissolution of the mid-century dress code that followed. The 1950s hat was not primarily a practical object in urban American daily life. It did not keep the wearer significantly warmer, drier, or better protected from sun than going hatless would have. Its function was almost entirely symbolic and social. It completed the dressed self. It indicated that the wearer had taken the trouble to be fully attired, and it provided, through its extraordinary variety of shapes and angles and trimmings, one of the most latitude-permitting elements in the otherwise tightly regulated mid-century dress vocabulary. The pillbox hat perched forward on a smooth updo communicated something quite different from the wide-brimmed picture hat tilted over the eye, which communicated something different still from the structured cloche pulled low over the brow, and within each form the specific materials and trimmings, grosgrain, velvet, silk flowers, feathers, veiling, multiplied the expressive possibilities considerably. The millinery industry that produced these objects was, in the mid-decade years, still a substantial American enterprise, with manufacturers in New York and Philadelphia, and regional millinery shops in virtually every American city staffed by trained milliners who could produce or modify hats to a customer's specific requirements. The custom hat had not yet been displaced entirely by ready-to-wear millinery, and the milliners who made them possessed a craft with specific, learnable technical components, wireframe construction, blocking on wooden forms over steam, trimming attachment, veil setting, that required genuine training and produced results that mass production could approximate but rarely match. The decline of the millinery industry in the early 1960s was rapid and essentially total, driven by the simultaneous adoption of more casual dress standards, the specific styling demands of the increasingly popular bouffant and beehive hairstyles that could not accommodate hat-wearing without significant structural disruption, and the cultural shift represented by Jacqueline Kennedy's famous refusal in the early months of the Kennedy administration to continue wearing hats to formal events, a decision that a hat industry trade publication estimated cost the American millinery business 40% of its formal occasion market within 18 months. The mid-century dress code that this volume has been examining was not eternal. It was a specific and historically contingent set of expectations that reached its maximum elaboration and strictness in approximately the years between 1950 and 1958, and then began to crack from the outside in, the younger generation wearing shorter skirts before the fashion press had officially sanctioned the change, the hatless younger woman appearing in spaces where a hat would previously have been unthinkable, the emergence of more casual sportswear silhouettes as acceptable daytime dress in contexts where they would not previously have been tolerated. By the time the 1960s were fully underway, the architecture of the mid-century dressed self, the girdle, the petticoat, the coordinated accessories, the hat, was already historical, already on its way to the nostalgia that now surrounds it. The women who wore it in its moment did not know they were wearing history. They were simply dressed, in the only way their world told them they should be, with the care and the specificity and the daily commitment that their moment required of them, and they went out the door and into the world, hat firmly placed, gloves smoothed, compact in bag, carrying themselves with the particular dignity that comes from knowing that your presentation is correct. That the standards defining correct were already preparing to shift is one of history's reliable rhythms. The dignity of the women who met those standards in their moment is, however, its own kind of permanent record. In the spring of 1952, Charles Revson, the founder, president, and absolute sovereign of Revlon Cosmetics, stood before the assembled buyers at a department store convention in Chicago and delivered a sentence that has been quoted so many times in the subsequent history of cosmetics marketing that it has achieved the status of aphorism. I don't sell lipstick. I sell hope in a tube. It is a sentence that would be easy to dismiss as the self-serving mythology of a man who was, by virtually every account of people who worked for him, a difficult and frequently ruthless businessman. But as a description of what red lipstick actually was to the women who wore it in the 1950s, it is not wrong. It is, if anything, insufficiently precise. What Revson was selling, what the decade's women were buying, and what the red lipstick delivered when it was applied, was not hope in the abstract sense of optimism, but something more specific and more structural, a concentrated dose of intentionality, a declaration of presence, a small daily act of self-assertion in a decade that provided women with rather limited opportunities for any of the above. To understand what red lipstick meant to the 1950s woman, you have to start with what it had meant to her mother and her older sisters during the war years, because the symbolic weight of red lipstick in the post-war decade was inseparable from its wartime history. The Second World War had produced one of the most remarkable episodes in cosmetics history: the sustained, systematic promotion of lipstick, and specifically of red lipstick, by the governments of both Britain and the United States as a tool of civilian morale and national resistance. In Britain, where cosmetics imports were severely restricted and domestic production was curtailed by the reallocation of raw materials to the war effort, Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein both received government exemptions to continue producing lipstick in specific shades that were chosen to complement the dark navy and khaki of the women's military uniforms and the civilian utility clothing that fashion had been reduced to. The British government's calculation was explicit. Women who looked well-groomed, who presented themselves with the kind of deliberate care that lipstick represented, were more productive workers, more resilient citizens, and more effective symbols of the national refusal to be demoralized. In the United States, the calculation was similar but expressed through commercial channels rather than government directive. Lipstick manufacturers, particularly Tangy, which had dominated the American lipstick market throughout the 1930s, with its Technicolor lipstick formula that adjusted on the lips to each wearer's individual pH level, and claimed to produce a personalized natural pink rather than a uniform color, actively positioned their product as a patriotic purchase. The Tangy advertising of the early and middle war years is among the most culturally revealing cosmetics advertising in American history. One campaign, which ran in multiple national magazines in 1941 and 42, features a headline that reads, "War, Women and Lipstick," and a body copy that draws an explicit analogy between the dictatorships that banned cosmetics for women and the democracy that embraced them, positioning the act of buying and wearing lipstick as itself a form of political resistance, an affirmation of the values that the war was being fought to protect. That cosmetics companies had very obvious financial reasons for making this argument did not make the argument ineffective. It gave women a framework for their cosmetics purchases that was simultaneously patriotic, psychologically satisfying, and entirely commercial, and this framework did not simply evaporate when the war ended. The red lipstick that the 1950s woman wore was thus already loaded with wartime associations of female strength, resilience, and purposeful self-presentation before it acquired its specifically peacetime meanings. But the peacetime context transformed these associations in interesting ways. The transition from wartime to domestic femininity that the post-war period demanded was not a simple relaxation of tension, but a redirection of energy. The same capacities for organization, management, and purposeful action that women had exercised in factories and government offices were now directed toward the home, toward domesticity, toward a sphere of activity that was simultaneously elevated in cultural rhetoric and diminished in social power. The red lipstick in this context carried the wartime association of female capability while fitting entirely within the domestic femininity that the peacetime cultural order prescribed. It was an acceptable form of power expression in a decade when most power expressions by women were not acceptable, and its acceptability derived precisely from the fact that it could be read as purely cosmetic, as decoration, while simultaneously functioning as something considerably more complex. The commercial competition that surrounded red lipstick throughout the decade was as fierce and technically sophisticated as anything else in the cosmetics industry, and the Revlon approach deserves particular attention because it was both commercially revolutionary and culturally revealing. Charles Revson had built Revlon on the premise that nail polish and lipstick should be sold as color coordinates, that the shade names and the color palettes that the company offered should create a desire not for any single product, but for a complete colour identity, a unified chromatic self-presentation that required the purchase of multiple coordinated items. This system, entirely commonplace now, was genuinely innovative in the early 1940s when Revlon introduced it, and by the early 1950s Revson had developed it into a full seasonal colour collection system that bore more resemblance to fashion house seasonal lines than to the traditional cosmetics approach of offering stable evergreen shades year after year. The shade names that Revlon applied to its lipstick line throughout the decade were themselves a form of cultural communication, and they repay attention. Where earlier lipstick naming had tended towards simple colour descriptions, Tangi's Natural, Rose and Red, or toward vague romance, names like Midnight or Passion that pointed toward nothing specific, Revlon's Revson understood that a shade name was a piece of narrative, a suggestion of a character the lipstick could help its wearer inhabit. The names that Revlon used throughout the 1950s, Cherries in the Snow, Fire and Ice, Persian Melon, Bachelor's Carnation, are miniature stories, each one suggesting a scene or a mood or a type of woman that the wearer could briefly try on. Cherries in the Snow in particular, launched in 1953 and arguably the most famous single lipstick shade in American cosmetics history, achieved its cultural traction not only because of its beautiful formulation, a blue-based red that photographed magnificently and flattered an extraordinary range of complexions, but because of the narrative it encapsulated. Something cold and something warm, something pure and something lush. The particular tension of feminine experience in the 1950s compressed into 4 words and a shade of red. Hazel Bishop, who had launched her no-smear lipstick in 1950, with a formulation based on a bromo-acid dye technology that she'd developed while working as a chemist at Standard Oil of New Jersey, offered the decade's most technically interesting alternative to the Revlon dominance. Bishop's formula used dye molecules that bonded directly to the proteins of the lip's surface layer rather than sitting atop the skin in the conventional pigment-in-wax suspension model, producing a colour that was genuinely resistant to transfer onto cups, cigarettes, or the faces of anyone who happened to come close enough for contact. The commercial success of no-smear lipstick was extraordinary in its early years. Bishop went from a kitchen table operation to a major national brand in approximately 18 months, through radio advertising that allowed women to hear exactly what she was claiming for her product before they bought it. But the formula that made the product distinctive also made it drying, and the women who loved the no-smear claim frequently compromised between Bishop's staying power and Revlon's superior skin feel by wearing one over the other. What red lipstick ultimately represented in the 1950s, and why it has remained the beauty category's most culturally resonant product through all the decades that have followed, is a form of daily self-authorship that was available to women at a moment when most other forms of self-authorship were not. The woman who chose her lipstick shade each morning was not simply selecting a colour. She was making a decision about what kind of presence she intended to have in the world that day, what statement she was prepared to make with her face, what version of herself she was choosing to be for the next several hours. The red that announced itself clearly, that declared intention, that made no attempt to disappear into the background. This was not vanity, but declaration. It was the most visible, the most immediate, the most accessible form of self-expression available within the constraints of the era's social world, and the women who wore it understood this, even when they would not have described it in exactly these terms. The lipstick tube uncapped in front of the bathroom mirror each morning was a small daily act of courage, the construction of a face for the world that said before any word was spoken, "I am here, I have chosen to be here, and I have decided exactly how I want you to see me." That remains the most important thing a woman has ever been allowed to say with cosmetics, and the mid-century red lip was its most eloquent expression. The specific chemistry of red lipstick in the 1950s is worth attending to, because the formulations of the period were technically sophisticated in ways that are often overlooked in the cultural history of the product. The basic lipstick structure, pigment suspended in a wax and oil base, with emollient and humectant additions, was not new to the decade, but the specific pigments available for red lipstick production had expanded significantly in the post-war years as the synthetic dye industry produced new colorants with better stability, better payoff, and better longevity than the natural and early synthetic dyes that had previously been used. The bromo acid dyes that Hazel Bishop had employed in her no-smear formulation particularly the D&C Red group that provided the blue-based cool-toned reds that photographed so beautifully and flattered such a wide range of complexions, were the chemical basis for many of the decade's most commercially successful reds, including Revlon's Cherries in the Snow. The wax matrix that carried these pigments also evolved considerably throughout the decade, with candelilla wax, carnauba wax, beeswax, and various synthetic waxes blended in ratios that balanced the competing demands of structure, payoff, moisture, and longevity in proportions that different manufacturers resolved differently, producing the distinct texture profiles that loyal consumers came to identify with their preferred brands. The lipstick brush, which the most technically accomplished women used for precise application, rather than applying directly from the tube, was an instrument of considerable refinement in the period. A good lipstick brush, flat-ended, firm but not stiff, made of natural hair, allowed the application of a defined lip line before filling in the centre, the technique that professional makeup artists used to achieve the clean, precise edge that was the hallmark of the period's fully finished lip. The practice of overlining the lips, drawing outside the natural lip line to create the appearance of greater fullness, was a technique widely used in theatrical makeup and in the more technically accomplished home practices of the decade, though the beauty magazines of the period discussed it with a discretion that reflected their ambivalence about a technique that might suggest artifice if detected. The instruction was typically framed as using the brush to define the natural line more clearly, rather than as a straightforward admission that the natural line was being altered. The red lipstick's cultural legacy in the decades since the 1950s is a story of continuous reinvention, periodic rediscovery, and enduring symbolic weight. Each decade has found its own relationship to the red lip, its own way of loading it with contemporary meaning. The 1960s stripped it of some of its mid-century formality, transplanting it into contexts that the previous decade would have considered inappropriate or excessive. The 1980s power-dressing moment gave it back its armour-like quality, the bold red lip reappearing as an element of the professional woman's deliberately assertive presentation, alongside the power suit and the structured shoulder. The 90s grunge reaction turned away from it toward dark berry shades and brown-based neutrals, only for the 2000s to cycle back to it as a retro reference. The current moment has fractured the red lipstick's cultural meaning across a much wider range of individual identities than any previous decade has accommodated. It is worn as nostalgia, as irony, as drag, as daily declaration, as occasional ceremony, as political statement, and as the simple pleasure of colour on a face. Simultaneously all of these things, and none of them exclusively. What remains constant through all these reframings is the visceral immediacy of the effect. A red lip changes a face with a speed and decisiveness that no other single cosmetic application matches. It draws the eye, focuses attention, sets the terms on which the face will be read. The women of the 1950s understood this with a clarity that was partly cultural inheritance and partly hard-won individual knowledge, and they applied their chosen shade each morning with the same intention and the same authority with which any craftsperson approaches their primary tool. The specific politics and constraints of their moment were their own, and not every element of what they were doing deserves uncritical nostalgia. But the act itself, the deliberate intentional making of a face for the world, the small daily insistence on being seen on one's own terms in the colour one has chosen, with the presence one has decided to bring, that act is not the property of any particular decade. It belongs to every woman who has ever uncapped a lipstick and decided that today the world was going to notice.